Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever found yourself, wrestling with a tough decision, wondering what the right thing to do truly is?
Hmm.
Or maybe you've pondered, like, what does it even mean to live a good life?
Absolutely. Those big questions.
Yeah, they aren't just casual thoughts, are they? They're fundamental, right at the heart of nearly every choice we make, really, from the deeply personal stuff to, well, global
They
impacts.
really are.
So today we're doing a deep dive into this fascinating, huge, and honestly incredibly relevant field. We're talking about ethics.
It's true. And what's interesting is while we all kind of possess an innate sense of right and wrong, don't we?
Yeah, I think so.
But the philosophical study of ethics, moral philosophy, as it's often called it, really digs into the why behind those instincts.
Oh, okay.
It asks not just what we do believe, but what we ought to believe, and crucially, how we should act.
And you've curated an incredible stack of sources for us today. It looks like a meticulously assembled map of moral thought, actually.
Well, I tried to bring together some key perspectives.
Our mission, then. Let's try to distill the absolute most important insights. Give you, the listener, a true shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about the core ideas of ethics.
Sounds like a plan.
We're going to navigate its main branches, explore the powerful theories that shape our moral reasoning, and then see how these profound ideas play out in the very real dilemmas we face every single day.
Right, bring it down to earth.
So let's get right to it. When we say ethics, what exactly are we talking about here? Is it just, another word for morality?
That's a great place to start. At its core, ethics is the philosophical inquiry into moral phenomena. It's asking those really fundamental questions. How should one live?
Wait,
Or what actions are morally right?
I feel like I've often heard ethics and morality used pretty much interchangeably, just in everyday conversation. Is there a subtle distinction that maybe philosophers tend to make?
There can be, yeah. While they are very close synonyms, some philosophers do draw a line. Morality might focus more on, let's say, specific obligations, the concrete rules of right and wrong. Ethics, on the other hand, often encompasses a broader view. It might delve into concepts of a good, flourishing life. And also, you tend to hear ethics applied to specific professional codes, right? Like business ethics or medical ethics.
Ah, yeah, that makes sense. And tracing back the roots, these definitely aren't modern inventions.
Not at all. The word ethics actually comes from the ancient Greek ethos, which means uh, character or personal disposition.
Huh, character.
Yeah. And morality, meanwhile, that's from the Latin moralis, referring to manners or character.
Hmm.
So both terms have these ancient origins, pointing to a long-standing human preoccupation with how we live and behave.
Okay, so our sources beautifully organize this field into three main branches. We've got normative ethics, applied ethics, and meta-ethics. Let's maybe start with normative ethics. That sounds like it's all about laying down the law for how we should act.
Precisely. Yeah, we connect this to the bigger picture. Normative ethics is really the branch that tries to establish general principles for human conduct.
General pen of...
Yeah, it's seeking, universal rules to determine what is objectively right and wrong. Think of it as asking, what should I do? And maybe even more importantly, why should I do it?
Okay.
And this is pretty distinct from descriptive ethics, which just, well, observes and describes existing moral beliefs without judging them.
Right. Descriptive just says what is. Normative says what ought to be.
Exactly.
And within normative ethics, what are the heavyweight champions, the most influential schools of thought?
Okay, so the three most influential are generally considered to be consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics.
Right.
And while they often present themselves as sort of competing frameworks, it's fascinating how they can sometimes lead to the very same moral action, but for completely different reasons.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they really give you different lenses, through which to view a moral problem.
Okay, let's unpack the first one then. Consequentialism. The name itself kind of shouts that consequences are absolutely key, right?
That's spot on. Consequentialism, sometimes called teleological ethics, argues that the morality of an action depends entirely on its outcome.
Entirely. Wow.
Yeah, an act is considered right if and only if it produces the best possible future or result, meaning no other available action could have generated a better consequence.
So it's basically defining right in terms of what produces the most good, whatever that good is.
Exactly. For example, classical utilitarianism, which is a really well-known form of consequentialism, it identifies pleasure or happiness as the ultimate good. So the right action is the one that leads to the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people.
And I notice in the sources that there are quite a few different flavors of consequentialism. It's not just one thing.
Oh no, there are indeed many variations.
Yes.
They diverge on what exactly is being evaluated. Is it individual acts, the motives behind them, or maybe the rules we follow?
Huh.
They also differ on what consequences actually matter. Is it just happiness, or maybe things like knowledge, friendship, or even equality?
Right. What counts as good?
Exactly. And how is that value determined? Is it a single source, like pleasure, or maybe a blend of multiple good things? And a key debate here is whether we focus just on the total aggregate good, or if the distribution of that good also plays a crucial role.
This next point from the sources really caught my eye, the distinction between act and rule consequentialism. It seems pretty fundamental.
It is. It's a big one. So act consequentialism looks at each individual act kind of in isolation and judges it directly by its consequences.
Okay.
So if lying in one specific situation happens to lead to a better outcome, an act consequentialist might say, well, that lie is permissible.
Right.
Rule consequentialism, on the other hand, asks a different question. What if everyone followed this rule? Would that lead to the best overall consequences?
Ah, okay. Like a system level view.
Kind of. So telling the truth might be considered a good rule, even if a specific lie might seem to have a better outcome in one instance, because, well, a world where everyone lies constantly would probably be worse overall.
Makes sense. But what about the future? I mean, how do we deal with the messy reality of not knowing exactly what's going to happen? Do we only care about actual results, even the unintended ones?
That's a crucial challenge, absolutely. So actual consequentialism judges actions solely on their real actual outcomes. The downside. This can mean a well-intentioned act could be deemed morally wrong if it just accidentally leads to negative results.
Ouch.
Yeah. However, expected consequentialism is maybe a bit more forgiving. It focuses on the outcomes that were reasonably anticipated, given our limited knowledge.
Okay.
This allows for an act to potentially have moral value, even if the outcome surprisingly turns negative. It judges based on foresight, not just hindsight.
And when we say the best outcome, are we always chasing the absolute perfect peak? Or is good enough ever okay in consequentialism?
Ah, another key distinction.
Yeah.
That's the difference between maximizing and satisficing consequentialism. Maximizing demands the absolute best possible action, no compromises. But critics argue this is often way too demanding. I mean, do you have to donate 70% of your salary if donating 65%? Also does a massive amount of good.
Yeah, that seems tough.
Exactly. Satisficing, conversely, says an act only needs to be good enough. It acknowledges that sometimes we can do more than is strictly required, a concept known as supererogation, doing more than your duty.
Supererogation. Okay. And historically, how far back does this kind of thinking go, focusing on consequences?
Well, one of the earliest forms actually emerged way back in 5th century BCE, ancient Chinese philosophy. There was a school of thought called Mohism.
Mohism.
Yeah, M-O-H-I-S-M. They promoted political actions specifically aimed at increasing the overall welfare of the people. Very consequence-focused.
Fascinating. And of course, the big name everyone knows in consequentialism is utilitarianism, that famous phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number.
Yes, that's the one. In its classical form, utilitarianism is a type of act consequentialism that identifies happiness or pleasure as the sole intrinsic value.
Intrinsic value meaning?
Meaning something that's good in itself, not just good because it leads to something else. Everything else, like, say, health or friendship, is seen as having extrinsic value because it contributes to that ultimate goal of happiness.
Got it.
And this idea that pleasure is the only intrinsic value, that is a name, too. Ethical hedonism.
Ethical hedonism. Okay.
Yeah.
And Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are the towering figures here, right? What were their core contributions?
Absolutely central figures. Bentham famously introduced the hedonic calculus. It was this attempt to quantify pleasure by considering factors like its intensity, duration, certainty, and so on.
Like a math equation for happiness?
Sort of, yeah. A bit mechanical, perhaps.
Hmm.
Mill, who was actually Bentham's student, built on this but refined it significantly. He made this famous distinction between higher pleasures, things like intellectual pursuits, art, reading,
Right.
and lower pleasures, which are more sensory, like food or drink.
And Mill thought the higher ones were better.
Yes. Mill argued that higher pleasures are inherently more valuable, even if they're less intense sometimes, challenging the simple idea that all pleasures are equal. He famously said, "It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied."
That really makes you think about what truly constitutes a good life, doesn't it?
It really does. quality over just quantity of pleasure.
Okay, now deontology. This feels like a complete pivot from consequentialism. Instead of focusing on outcomes, it seems to be all about rules and duties. Is that a fair starting point?
Absolutely, that's the core idea. Deontology assesses actions based on their inherent rightness, meaning whether they adhere to certain norms or principles like always tell the truth or keep your promises.
Regardless of the outcome.
Exactly. Unlike consequentialists, deontologists believe the validity of these principles does not directly depend on their consequences. The action itself, its nature, is what matters morally.
So for a strict deontologist, breaking a promise would be wrong, even if somehow no one got hurt or maybe even knew about it.
Precisely. From a deontological perspective, the act itself, by violating a duty or a rule, is inherently wrong. And you'll find many deontological theories focus heavily on prohibitions. What acts are forbidden under any circumstances, regardless of the potential good outcomes they might bring about.
That sounds quite rigid.
It can be, yes.
Yeah.
It's often a criticism.
Now, I came across agent-centered and patient-centered deontological theories in the sources. Can you break down that distinction for us? What's the difference there?
Sure. Agent-centered theories put the focus squarely on the person acting and their duties or obligations. They often highlight the importance of motives and intentions behind the action.
Okay.
And these duties can be agent-relative, meaning they apply specifically to the acting agent.
Right.
Think about a parent. They have a special obligation to their own child that they don't necessarily have to every child in the world.
All right. A special duty.
Exactly.
Okay.
Patient-centered theories, conversely, shift the focus. They look at the rights of the people affected by the actions, the patients of the action, so to speak.
Rights-based.
Yes. And these rights are typically seen as agent-neutral, applying universally. For instance, the famous requirement to treat all people as ends in themselves and never merely as means to an end. That protects the patient of the action.
And that brings us to Immanuel Kant. He's, of course, a giant in deontology. What was his big idea? How did he propose we figure out what our duties actually are?
Kant is absolutely central. He built this incredibly influential system around universal laws he called categorical imperatives.
Categorical imperatives, meaning?
Meaning they are commands, imperatives, that are unconditional, categorical. They apply to all rational beings, everywhere, always, regardless of their personal desires or goals.
Wow, universal.
Exactly. For Kant, to act morally is fundamentally to act in perfect agreement with reason, as expressed by these principles. Violating them, he argued, is not only immoral, but actually irrational.
So what are some of his key formulations of that categorical imperative? How does it actually guide us?
Well, his most famous one is often paraphrased as, act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will become a universal law.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So basically, before you do something, ask yourself, what's the underlying principle or rule, the maxim of my action? Then ask, could I honestly want this rule to be followed by everyone, everywhere, all the time?
Like if I'm thinking of lying to get out of trouble?
Exactly. The maxim might be lie when it's convenient. Could you will that to be a universal law? Probably not, right? Because if everyone lied whenever it was convenient, trust would break down. Language itself might become meaningless. So the action fails the test.
Got it. And the other formulation about treating people as ends.
Right. The second major one is to always treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, as an end in itself, and never merely as a means.
Never use people.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Don't just use people as tools or objects to achieve your own goals. Recognize their inherent dignity and worth as rational beings.
So, if someone tells a small white lie just to avoid hurting a friend's feelings, that seems well-intentioned. Would Kant still say that's morally wrong?
From a strict Kantian perspective,
Yeah.
yes, because you're still violating the universalizability principle. You wouldn't want lying to be universal. And arguably, you might be using your friend's ignorance or manipulating them as a means to avoid an awkward conversation, rather than treating them with full rational respect.
It highlights the rigidity, doesn't it?
It does. For Kant, the goodwill, acting purely out of respect for the moral law, for duty's sake, is unconditionally good. The consequences, good or bad, are secondary.
Okay. Beyond Kant, the sources mention other interesting deontological approaches. Divine command theory, for example. That puts the source of morality in a very different place.
It certainly does. Divine command theory posits that morality originates directly from God or a divine being. Moral laws are seen quite literally as divine commands.
Like the Ten Commandments.
Exactly like the Ten Commandments in Christianity and Judaism, or the teachings found in the Quran in Islam. The right thing to do is simply what God commands, and the wrong thing is what God forbids.
And then there's contractualism. That seems to shift the source of morality away from divine authority and more towards humans themselves.
Exactly. Contractualists argue that morality is based on some kind of agreement, an explicit or implicit social contract between humans.
Like, we all agree to follow certain rules for mutual benefit.
Precisely. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and more recently John Rawls used thought experiments. They imagined rational people, maybe in some initial state of nature or behind a veil of ignorance, figuring out what rules they would all agree to live by to create a stable, fair society. It really emphasizes the idea of consent and mutual agreement as the foundation of our moral obligations.
And Jürgen Habermas's discourse ethics also sounds like it builds on social agreement, but maybe with a different process.
Indeed. Habermas's approach, discourse ethics, suggests that moral norms find their justification through rational discussion and consensus within a community.
Through talking it out.
Essentially, yes, a universal moral norm is considered valid if all rational participants in what he called an ideal speech situation, basically, a fair, inclusive discussion without any power imbalances or coercion would approve of it. It's a very deliberative, communicative approach to establishing moral principles. Relies heavily on rational argumentation.
Okay, that covers deontology. Finally, we have virtue ethics. Now, this feels like a completely different lens again compared to consequentialism and deontology. It seems to focus less on specific actions or consequences and more on, well, on who we are as people.
That's a perfect summary. That's exactly right. Virtue ethics' primary concern isn't isolating right actions or maximizing good outcomes, but rather the cultivation and expression of virtues.
Virtues being.
Positive character traits. Things like honesty, courage, kindness, compassion, justice, temperance. The list goes on. It's about developing ingrained dispositions, habits, really to feel, decide, and act in a morally commendable way.
So it's not just about having these virtues on paper, you have to actively do something with them.
Not quite just having them, no. Virtue theorists strongly emphasize manifesting these virtues in action, and crucially, that requires something they call practical wisdom. The Greeks called it phronesis.
Practical wisdom. Phronesis, what is that exactly?
It's not just theoretical knowledge, it's the street smarts of morality, you could say.
Yeah.
It's knowing when, how, and which virtue to express in a specific, complex situation. For example, courage is a virtue, right?
Right.
But practical wisdom is what prevents courage from becoming recklessness, which is a vice, or it helps you know when honesty needs to be tempered with kindness. It's like having a finely tuned moral compass for navigating the nuances of real life.
So it's more about judgment and context.
Very much so. Context and wise judgment are key.
What are some of the key approaches or types within virtue ethics?
Well, there's eudaimonism, which comes straight from ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle. It links virtuous behavior directly to eudaimonia, often translated as human flourishing or living well. It views virtues as the traits that help us actualize our positive human potentials and live a truly good life.
Flourishing. I like that.
Yeah, that's a powerful concept.
Mm.
Then there are agent-based theories, which focus more on identifying admirable traits and motivational characteristics that we see expressed in action, often by looking at moral exemplars, people we admire, and learning from them.
Okay.
And another important strand, especially in more recent philosophy, is the feminist ethics of care. This emphasizes virtues like benevolence, compassion, empathy, and caring for others' well-being, particularly within the context of interpersonal relationships.
And Aristotle is, of course, a central figure here, especially with his famous concept of the golden mean.
Absolutely. Aristotle deeply shaped virtue ethics. He believed that each virtue is a kind of golden mean, a sweet spot, nestled between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency.
Can you give an example?
Sure, the classic one is courage. Courage is the mean. The deficiency, the lack of it, is cowardice. The excess, too much of it, is recklessness or rashness.
Ah, okay. So virtue is about finding the right balance.
Exactly. Finding that appropriate balance in feelings and actions. He, along with the Stoics, or another major ancient school, focused on rationality, self-mastery, and achieving a peaceful mind through virtue, saw virtuous action as the direct pathway to true happiness or flourishing.
And virtue ethics kind of faded for a while, but came back.
It did. After being dominant in the ancient world, it was somewhat overshadowed by deontology and utilitarianism for centuries. But it experienced a really significant revival in the mid to late 20th century, and it's a major player in ethical discussions today.
Okay, so those are the big three: consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. But beyond these major frameworks, your sources mention a fascinating array of other normative ethical traditions. What else is out there that gives us a different way to think about how we should act?
Oh, there's a lot to explore, definitely. For instance, pragmatist ethics really stands out. It tends to be less focused on finding universal abstract rules and more on solving practical moral problems as they arise in concrete situations.
More practical.
Yeah, it often sees morality as deeply embedded in our social and cultural contexts and frequently emphasizes the importance of habits in shaping moral behavior. It asks, what works ethically in the real world?
And postmodern ethics sounds quite radical in its view of moral
It
principles.
often is, yes.
Ugh.
Postmodern ethics frequently agrees with the idea of cultural relativity, but it often goes further by rejecting the very possibility of objective, universal moral principles altogether.
No universal truth.
That's often the claim. It might suggest that morality can be irrational, inconsistent, and that humans are fundamentally morally ambivalent. Instead of grand theories, it might focus more on the specific, intense moral demands that arise in unique, face-to-face encounters with others.
Different focus entirely. What about ethical egoism? That one caught my eye, sounds rather self-focused.
It is. Ethical egoism is the normative theory that proposes that people should act in their own self-interest. Full stop.
Should, not just that they do.
Exactly. That's the crucial difference from psychological egoism, which is just a descriptive claim that people do, in fact, always act selfishly. Ethical egoism makes the moral claim that acting selfishly is the right thing to do.
Cool.
Now, an ethical egoist might still benefit others, but only if doing so ultimately serves their own long-term interests.
Right, as a means to their own end.
Precisely.
And of course, we can't ignore the fact that ethics holds a central, profound place in religions all around the world.
Absolutely vital. I mean, from Jewish ethics, emphasizing the 613 mitzvot commandments and prioritizing societal welfare, to Christian ethics centered on selfless love, agape, and following Jesus' example,
Right.
to Muslim ethics rooted in the Quran and the five pillars, guiding all aspects of life. Then you have Buddhist and Jain traditions deeply centered on compassion, karuna, and nonviolence, ahimsa,
Mm-hmm.
Hindu ethics focusing on dharma, duty, and complex social obligations within the caste system historically. Confucianism in East Asia, emphasizing societal harmony, filial piety, and virtues like benevolence. Ren, Taoism teaching harmony with the natural flow, the Tao, and indigenous belief systems across the globe, often emphasizing deep interconnectedness with nature and community responsibilities. All offer incredibly rich, diverse, and influential ethical frameworks that guide billions of lives.
It's a vast landscape just within religious ethics alone.
Truly vast.
Okay, so we've discussed how we should act, exploring these major theories like consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, and others. But what if we peel back another layer? What are we even talking about when we use words like right and wrong? Is there an objective truth to them, or are they just, I don't know, made up?
That sounds like the fascinating and maybe slightly dizzying territory of metaethics.
Precisely, you've nailed it. Metaphysics operates at a higher level of abstraction. It steps back from prescribing actions and instead asks these really fundamental questions about the nature, the foundations, and the scope of moral judgments and values themselves.
So not is X wrong, but what does wrong even mean?
Exactly. It dives into questions like, are moral judgments objective facts about the world, like scientific facts? Can moral statements even be true or false in the first place? And what do core moral terms like good, bad, right, wrong, morality actually mean when we use them?
And I noticed in the sources it overlaps quite a bit with other branches of philosophy and even science. It really does. It delves deep into ontology, which is the study of being, asking, do objective moral facts actually exist in reality?
Okay.
It gets into semantics, the study of meaning. What do moral terms mean? Do moral statements express beliefs that can be true or false or something else entirely, like emotions or commands? It involves epistemology, the study of knowledge. How do we actually know moral truths if they exist? How can we justify our moral beliefs? And it even touches on psychology. How do our moral judgments actually motivate us to act? And anthropology. How do cultural differences impact our moral assessments and the very concepts we use? It's incredibly interdisciplinary.
Wow. Okay, so under this metaphysics umbrella, what are some of the fundamental concepts it explores at this deeper level?
Well, a crucial one is the distinction between normative statements, statements about what ought to be or what is good or bad, right or wrong, and descriptive statements, which are just about what is the case, facts about the world.
The is versus ought gap.
Exactly. That's a classic philosophical problem that ethics grapples with. It also examines core concepts like duties and obligations, permissions, what's morally okay to do, and that general contrast between good and bad or even evil.
And supererogation came up again.
Yes. That idea of supererogation, doing more than is strictly morally required, going above and beyond the call of duty in ethics, asks if that concept makes sense and what its status is. And of course, the huge concept of moral responsibility. When is someone praiseworthy or blameworthy for their actions? What conditions need to be met?
Okay, here's where it seems to get really interesting, according to the sources. This major philosophical debate. Are moral values real, objective features of the world, maybe like gravity or mathematical truths? Or are they entirely human inventions, constructions?
That's the absolute core question about the ontological status of morality. Where does morality live, so to speak?
Okay.
And there are three main camps.
Okay.
First, you have moral realism. Realists argue that objective moral facts do exist, independently of human minds, beliefs, or cultural conventions.
Like, murder is wrong is just true, period.
That's the idea for a moral realist.
Yeah.
It implies there's an absolute truth about whether an action is right or wrong. And if two people or cultures disagree about a moral issue, well, at least one of them has to be mistaken.
Okay, that's realism. What's the alternative?
The main alternative is moral relativism. Relativists counter realism by claiming that moral principles are essentially human constructs.
So we make them up.
In a sense, yes. What's right or wrong becomes subjective, relative to a particular person, subjectivism, or a culture, cultural relativism, or maybe even a historical period. Relativism might suggest that moral systems are perhaps designed primarily for social coordination, or maybe that morality simply arises from emotions, which obviously differ from person to person and group to group.
So no single right answer for everyone.
That's the implication of most forms of relativism, yes.
Yeah.
And then there's a third, even more radical position.
Which is?
Moral nihilism. Nihilists take it a step further and deny the existence of any moral facts whatsoever, objective or subjective.
Nothing is right or wrong.
Pretty much. Moral nihilism views the basic assumptions underlying all moral claims as fundamentally misguided. From this perspective, judging actions as right or wrong is just another type of human behavior, maybe expressing preferences or power dynamics, but it doesn't involve any actual morality because, well, morality itself doesn't really exist.
Wow. That's a stark view.
It is indeed.
And within moral realism itself, the view that there are objective moral facts, there's another split mentioned, naturalism versus non-naturalism. What's the difference there?
Right, so if you're a moral realist, you believe moral facts exist. The next question is, what kind of facts are they? Moral naturalism argues that moral properties, like goodness or rightness, are essentially natural properties.
Natural properties like?
Like properties that are observable, or at least discoverable, through empirical methods similar to those we study in the natural sciences. Perhaps moral properties can even be reduced to other natural properties, like, say, causing pleasure or promoting survival.
Okay, so morality is part of the natural world.
That's the naturalist view. Moral non-naturalism, on the other hand, agrees that moral properties are real and objective, but claims they are unique, sui generis properties that cannot be reduced to natural properties.
So they're real, but different, not scientific.
Exactly. Non-naturalists often emphasize the prescriptive or normative nature of moral properties, their inherent oughtness. They argue that you can't simply derive an ought, what should be, from an is, a natural fact. So moral facts exist, but they're in a category of their own.
Okay, complex stuff. So we've talked about whether moral values exist. How about the very language we use when we talk about morality? Do moral statements like saying murder is wrong actually have a truth value? Can they be true or false?
This delves right into the semantics of moral language.
Yeah.
And again, there's a major split here between cognitivism and non-cognitivism.
Cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Okay.
Cognitivism says, yes, moral statements are the kind of statements that can be true or false. They express beliefs about the world, and those beliefs can either correspond to reality, be true, or not be false. This view is often, though not always, linked to moral realism.
Makes sense. If moral facts exist, then statements about them can be true or false.
Right. An interesting twist here is something called error theory. Error theorists are cognitivists. They agree moral statements aim to state truths, but they combine this with moral nihilism. They argue that all positive moral statements, like charity is good or torture is wrong, are actually false because there are no moral facts in the world for them to correspond to.
So we're always mistaken when we make moral claims.
According to error theory, yes. We're trying to describe moral facts, but since none exist, our descriptions are always wrong.
Okay. What about the other side? Non-cognitivism.
Non-cognitivism argues that moral statements fundamentally lack a truth value. They aren't trying to describe the world or state facts at all. Instead, they serve a different function. Well, different non-cognitivist theories propose different functions. For example, emotivism, which was popular in the early 20th century, suggests that when you say murder is wrong, you're not stating a fact, but simply expressing your emotional attitude, like saying boo, murder, or murder, yuck.
Just expressing feelings.
Exactly. Another view, prescriptivism, sees moral statements more as commands or recommendations. So, murder is wrong might mean something like, do not commit murder, or I prescribe that you don't commit murder. They guide action rather than state facts.
So, cognitivism. Moral talk aims at truth. Non-cognitivism. Moral talk expresses feelings or commands.
That's a good basic summary, yes.
Okay, this is a really big one then. If moral truths or facts might exist, at least for realists, can we actually know them? How do we access them? How do we figure out right from wrong?
Right. This brings us squarely into the epistemology of metaethics, the theory of moral knowledge. How do we know, if at all?
So what are the main views here?
Well, some views are foundationalist. They suggest that some moral beliefs are basic or self-evident, not needing justification from other beliefs. Ethical intuitionism is a classic example.
Intuitionism, we just know.
Sort of. Intuitionists posit that humans have a special cognitive faculty, a kind of moral sense or intuition, that allows us to directly grasp certain fundamental moral truths. These truths are often seen as self-evident, like it's wrong to cause needless suffering or promises should generally be kept.
Feels a bit mysterious, maybe.
That's a common reaction. The alternative is often coherentism. Coherentists believe there are no truly basic foundational moral beliefs. Instead, our moral beliefs form an interconnected network, or web.
Like all web?
Yeah. A moral belief is justified not because it's self-evident, but because it fits well. It coheres with all our other beliefs, moral and non-moral, in the network. Knowledge comes from the overall consistency and mutual support within the system of beliefs.
Okay, so it's about consistency.
Right. And then, of course, you have the more skeptical views. Moral skeptics, in the strong sense, deny that moral knowledge is possible at all. They might argue our intuitions are unreliable, or that cultural disagreement is too vast, or that we simply have no reliable method for distinguishing true moral beliefs from false ones.
So we just can't know for sure.
That's the skeptical conclusion, yes.
And I've heard about some classic thought experiments that philosophers use to really push these ideas to test our intuitions and theories.
Oh, yes. Thought experiments are crucial tools in ethics, especially normative ethics, but also meta-ethics. They present hypothetical, often stripped down, dilemmas designed to isolate specific moral principles or intuitions and see how different theories handle them.
Like the trolley problem.
The trolley problem is the most famous, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, the runaway trolley, 5 people tied to one track, one person on another track, you're by a switch. Do you flip the switch to divert the trolley, saving the 5 but killing the 1?
Right. And the variation with pushing the large person off the bridge?
Exactly. That variation really explores the moral difference many people feel between actively doing harm, pushing someone, versus maybe allowing harm or diverting a threat, flipping a switch. It pits utilitarian calculations against deontological prohibitions.
And there are others.
Many others. Judith Jarvis Thomson's violinist problem is another classic, often used in discussions about abortion. It asks you to imagine waking up involuntarily connected via tubes to a famous unconscious violinist who needs your kidneys to survive for 9 months. Are you morally obligated to stay plugged in? It pushes on questions about bodily autonomy versus the right to life. These scenarios really force us to confront our core moral intuitions and see if our theories can make sense of them.
They certainly make you think. Okay, finally, within metaethics, there's this psychological question. How do our moral beliefs actually make us act? Why do some people seem driven by their morality, while others might know what's right, but just don't do it?
Right, this is the question of moral motivation. What's the connection, if any, between making a moral judgment and being moved to act accordingly?
And what are the main ideas here?
There are broadly 2 camps again, internalists and externalists. Motivational internalists propose that there's a direct internal necessary link between genuinely judging something as right or wrong and being motivated, at least to some degree, to act on that judgment.
So if I truly believe saving the draining child is right, I'll automatically feel some pull to do it.
That's the internalist idea.
Yeah.
A famous historical example is Socrates, who seemed to believe that a person performs evil only if they are unaware that it is evil, that true moral knowledge necessarily leads to right action, or at least the motivation for it.
Okay. What about externalists?
Motivational externalists argue that the link isn't necessary or internal. They believe it's perfectly possible for someone to sincerely judge an act as morally required, yet feel absolutely no motivation whatsoever to do it.
Like the person who knows smoking is bad but feels no urge to quit.
Kind of, but applied to moral judgments. For an externalist, the moral judgment itself doesn't automatically provide motivational force. Any motivation to be moral must come from some external source, perhaps a desire to be seen as good, a fear of punishment, sympathy for others, or some other contingent psychological factor. The moral belief alone isn't enough.
So the link between belief and action is contingent, not necessary.
Exactly. That's the externalist position. It's a really interesting debate about the fundamental nature of moral psychology.
Definitely. Okay, wow. We've gone from what should we do to what does should even mean.
Mm.
Now, after wrestling with all that abstract theory about the nature of morality and the big frameworks for how we should act, we can finally bring it down to earth. This next section, applied ethics, seems like it's all about tackling concrete moral problems in real-life situations. Is that right?
That's exactly it. It's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Applied ethics generally doesn't aim to discover entirely new universal principles, but rather to examine how those existing principles and theories like Kantianism or utilitarianism or virtue ethics can be applied to very specific domains, specific problems.
Okay.
And it also asks whether any unique factors within those particular domains, like medicine or business or the environment, need special consideration when we're trying to figure out the right thing to do.
And I imagine bridging that gap between a grand philosophical theory like Kant's categorical imperative and a really messy, complex, real-world dilemma, that's probably quite challenging.
It certainly is. That's often the main challenge in applied ethics.
Yeah.
How do you effectively translate these abstract concepts into practical, actionable guidance for incredibly complex situations like, say, abortion or climate change policy or the ethics of developing artificial intelligence? It's rarely a straightforward plug-and-play kind of application.
So how do ethicists even go about doing applied ethics? Are there different methodologies they use?
Yes, there are broadly different approaches. You can use a top-down methodology. That starts with a preferred universal principle or theory, like utilitarianism, and then tries to deduce conclusions about specific cases from it.
Start with the theory, apply it down.
Exactly. Or there's a bottom-up approach, often associated with a method called casuistry. This starts the other way around. It looks closely at our considered moral intuitions and judgments about specific, concrete cases,
Start with the cases.
and then tries to build up or identify mid-level principles that seem relevant to that particular domain or type of case. Often, in practice, people use a mix of both, kind of moving back and forth between general principles and specific case judgments. And frequently, this whole inquiry gets triggered by a clear ethical dilemma, a situation where different moral considerations seem to pull us in conflicting directions.
Makes sense. Okay, let's look at some of the big areas. Bioethics. That covers a huge, sprawling range of moral problems related to living organisms, right? What's one of the foundational questions it tries to answer?
Yes, bioethics is massive, and a really key foundational problem within it is determining moral status. This has the question: what features or properties, like maybe consciousness or the ability to feel pleasure and pain, sentience or rationality or personhood, grant an entity moral consideration?
Why does that matter so much?
Because how we answer that question profoundly impacts how we believe we should treat different kinds of beings. It determines our obligations, or lack thereof, towards everything from, say, rocks and plants, to non-human animals, to human embryos and fetuses, to patients in persistent vegetative states, maybe even to advanced AI in the future.
Wow. Okay, so how do different views decide who or what gets moral consideration? What are the main lines?
Well, there are several key perspectives outlined in the sources. First, you have anthropocentrism. That's the view that only humans have fundamental moral status. Our moral duties are primarily, or perhaps exclusively, to other humans. Animals or the environment matter only insofar as they affect humans.
Human-centered.
Exactly. Then there's sentientism. This expands the circle of moral consideration to include all sentient beings, typically defined as anything capable of experiencing pleasure or pain. So many non-human animals would be included here.
Okay, includes feeling animals.
Right. Going further, you have biocentrism. This view argues that all living organisms, whether they're sentient or not, so including plants, maybe even simple organisms, have some inherent moral status or value simply by virtue of being alive.
All life.
That's the idea. And finally, ecocentrism takes the broadest view. It asserts that not just individual organisms, but entire ecosystems, species, or perhaps even all of nature as an interconnected whole, possesses fundamental moral status or value. It emphasizes ecological integrity and the health of the whole system.
So very different scopes of moral concern there. And the actual topics bioethics addresses are incredibly current, aren't they? Cutting right to the heart of modern dilemmas.
Absolutely. Bioethics grapples with some of the most contentious issues of our time. Things like abortion, cloning, genetic engineering, stem cell research, euthanasia, and physician-assisted suicide. Decisions about end-of-life care.
Right.
But also things like animal experimentation, the ethics of intensive animal farming, factory farming, and broader environmental concerns like managing nuclear waste, tackling air and water pollution, and responding to climate change. It's a vast field.
And it's often further divided into medical ethics, animal ethics, and environmental ethics, each with its own specific focus.
That's a common and useful way to break it down, yes. Medical ethics is arguably the oldest branch, with roots stretching way back to the Hippocratic Oath in ancient Greece. It covers issues around the start and end of human life, like the moral status of fetuses or the right to refuse treatment or end one's life. It also deals with crucial concepts like medical confidentiality, informed consent from patients, fairness in allocating scarce resources like organs or ICU beds, and ensuring equitable access to healthcare.
Huge issues in healthcare.
Absolutely. Then you have animal ethics. This focuses specifically on the moral questions surrounding how humans treat other animals. It emphasizes concepts like animal welfare, minimizing harm, and sentience. It directly addresses practices like factory farming, animal testing, zoos, hunting, and delves into the idea of animal rights. Do animals have rights, like a right to life, or a right to freedom from unnecessary suffering?
Always a passionate debate there.
Always.
Yeah.
And thirdly, environmental ethics deals with our moral relationship to the natural environment as a whole. It covers everything from sustainable agriculture and resource use to biodiversity loss, pollution control, global warming, and climate justice, who bears the burdens, and prompts us to consider our ethical duties toward future generations who will inherit the planet we leave behind.
Very future-oriented as well.
Necessarily so, yes.
Okay, moving on to another major area, business and professional ethics. These seem clearly highly relevant to many of our listeners in their daily working lives. How do these deep ethical principles apply in the corporate world and within specific professions?
Yes, these are vitally important fields of applied ethics. Business ethics examines the moral principles and problems that arise in a business context. A core concept here, which gets a lot of attention, is corporate social responsibility, or CSR.
CSR, what does that entail?
It's essentially the idea that corporations have ethical responsibilities that go beyond just maximizing profits for their shareholders. They have a duty to act in ways that benefit, or at least don't harm, society as a whole, considering the interests of all stakeholders, employees, customers, communities, the environment.
Broader responsibility.
Exactly. Business ethics also covers more specific practical issues like honesty in advertising, fair labor practices, preventing bribery and corruption, managing conflicts of interest, ensuring product safety, protecting whistleblowers, and fostering ethical leadership within organizations.
Lots of practical implications.
Definitely. Then, relatedly, you have professional ethics. This applies ethical principles to the specific contexts and responsibilities of particular professions. Think engineers, doctors, lawyers, accountants, journalists, teachers.
So codes of conduct for different jobs.
Precisely. While some universal principles often apply across professions like maintaining expertise, acting with integrity, upholding client confidentiality, more specific requirements vary depending on the profession's role in society. For instance, engineering ethics places a paramount emphasis on public safety. Legal ethics stresses duties to the client but also to the system of justice. And journalism ethics emphasizes principles like accuracy, truthfulness, fairness, and impartiality in reporting.
Tailored to the profession's impact.
Exactly.
Okay, besides bioethics and business professional ethics, what are some other fascinating subfields of applied ethics that caught your eye in the sources?
Oh, there are many intriguing ones. The sources mention communication ethics, which addresses issues like freedom of speech, hate speech, propaganda, and the ethical responsibilities that come with communication.
Relevant in the digital age.
Extremely. There's also information ethics, which focuses specifically on the moral implications of creating, controlling, distributing, and using information, privacy, surveillance, intellectual property, the digital divide.
Also very current.
And then there's the very broad umbrella of the ethics of technology. This considers the ethical risks, benefits, and responsible use of all kinds of technologies and artifacts, from simple tools to complex systems, and even touches on things like human enhancement technologies.
I can imagine the ethics of technology must have many sub-branches of its own, given how fast technology is evolving these days.
It absolutely does. It branches into rapidly developing areas like computer ethics and cyber ethics, AI ethics, which is just exploding right now, dealing with bias, autonomy, control. Machine ethics, can machines themselves be moral agents? Nanotechnology ethics, bioengineering ethics, and even things like nuclear ethics, especially concerning the development and use of nuclear weapons, but also nuclear energy.
AI ethics seems particularly challenging.
Hugely challenging, with profound implications.
And then there's something as weighty and historically significant as the ethics of war.
Yes, the ethics of war, sometimes called just war theory, investigates the profound moral problems associated with organized violent conflict.
Just war theory. What does that involve?
It traditionally outlines conditions under which resorting to war might be morally justified. The jus ad bellum criteria, like having a just cause, right intention, being a last resort, having a reasonable chance of success. And it also lays out ethical rules for how war should be conducted. Jus in bello criteria, like discriminating between combatants and non-combatants, and ensuring proportionality between military objectives and collateral damage.
So rules for starting and fighting wars.
Essentially, yes. It tries to bring moral constraints to bear on the reality of warfare. And related to that is military ethics, which specifically governs the conduct of military personnel themselves, dealing with issues like obedience to orders, treatment of prisoners, and rules of engagement.
And it seems like this list of applied ethics fields could go on and on.
It really could. Yes, the sources also touch on things like political ethics, ethics in government and public service, educational ethics, moral issues in teaching and learning, sexual ethics, morality related to sexuality and relationships, and many others. It just goes to show how pervasive ethical questions are. They really permeate almost every domain of human activity.
Absolutely. It's abundantly clear from all this that ethics isn't just an isolated philosophical pursuit. It connects deeply to so many other areas of study. What are some of the most prominent related fields that either inform our understanding of ethics or are informed by it?
They're highly interconnected fields, for sure. One very closely linked area is value theory, which is sometimes called axiology. This is the philosophical study of value itself. What is goodness? What makes something valuable?
Right, we touched on that with consequentialism.
Exactly. It distinguishes, for example, between intrinsic value, something good in itself, like happiness or knowledge perhaps, and instrumental value, something good only as a means to achieve something else intrinsically valuable, like money. Many ethical theories, especially consequentialism, explicitly define what is right in terms of producing what is good, so they rely heavily on value theory to tell them what good actually consists in.
So value theory asks what is good, ethics asks what is right.
That's a common way to think about the relationship, yes, though they overlap significantly. Then there's moral psychology. This is different because it's primarily empirical science, not philosophy, although they inform each other greatly.
Empirical meaning based on observation.
Yes, based on observation, experiments, data. Moral psychology investigates the actual psychological processes involved when people make moral judgments and engage in moral behavior. It studies things like how moral reasoning works in the brain, how character traits are formed and influence behavior, how we attribute moral responsibility to others, feelings like guilt and empathy.
Fascinating.
It is. It also looks at moral development across the lifespan, like Lawrence Kohlberg's famous stages, suggesting children progress from seeing morality as fixed rules imposed by authority towards understanding more abstract ethical principles. And it explores practical questions like how morality might actually be taught or encouraged.
Learning how we do think morally and not just how we should.
Exactly. Another related field is evolutionary ethics. This explores how biological evolution might have shaped human moral capacities and behaviors.
Like morality helped us survive.
That's the core idea. It suggests that morality, or at least certain proto-moral sentiments like altruism, cooperation, fairness, might be adaptations traits that offered a selective advantage to our ancestors, perhaps by promoting group cohesion and survival. It adds a really interesting biological dimension to the question of why we are moral beings at all. And finally, it's useful to contrast normative ethics with descriptive ethics, which we mentioned briefly earlier. Sometimes it's called comparative ethics.
Right, the what is rather than what ought to be.
Precisely. Descriptive ethics aims to study and describe the existing moral codes, practices, beliefs, and values found in different societies, groups, or historical periods without making judgments about whether they are right or wrong. It's a multidisciplinary field, drawing heavily from anthropology, sociology, psychology, and history to simply understand the sheer diversity and commonalities of human moral systems across time and culture.
So, mapping the moral landscape as it exists.
That's a great way to put it.
Wow. This has truly been an expansive deep dive into ethics. We've journeyed from its ancient origins, explored these fundamental frameworks for thinking about right and wrong, delved into the very meaning of morality itself with metaethics, and seen how it all plays out in concrete, modern-day applications. It's crystal clear that this field is anything but simple, isn't it? There are profound questions at every single turn.
Indeed. It's been quite a journey. We've navigated through those core principles, consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics that attempt to guide our actions. We've examined the very nature of moral reality and moral language. And we've seen how ethical thinking is absolutely essential for grappling with the most complex real-world scenarios we face, from the hospital room to the boardroom to the global stage. It really highlights how these abstract ideas are deeply intertwined with the fabric of our daily lives and societies.
So after covering all this ground, what does this all mean for you, our listener? What's the big takeaway from exploring all these different ways of thinking about right and wrong, about living a good life?
Well, that really raises an important final question for reflection, doesn't it? Given the incredible diversity of frameworks we've explored today, thinking about consequences versus duties versus character, and then layering on top all those meta-ethical debates about whether moral truth even exists objectively, how might understanding these different lenses potentially change the way you approach your own moral decisions day to day? How might it shift the way you evaluate the really difficult ethical dilemmas facing our communities, our world today? And perhaps how might it even change the kinds of conversations you have about these complex issues with the people around you? Something to really mull over.